Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this Stop the War meeting tonight. My name's Lindsay German. I'm the convener of Stop the War. I'm not going to take your time for more than a couple of minutes. I just want to say two things. We've got a new campaign against military spending, the increases in military spending, which we're seeing from this Tory government, which the amounts that they're increasing spending is going to be about the same as the proposed public sector pay freeze that they're implementing. They'll save as much from that as they're now going to spend on defence. So we'd like to ask you to go to our website and sign up to our petition and sign up to the campaign. Second thing I'd like you to do is we've got our annual appeal, and I'd like you to again go to the website, donate if you can, and we have an event on the 11th of December, which both Tariq and Jeremy will also be at, which is our annual fundraiser. So please do join us if you can with that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers tonight. We're very, very privileged to have both of them. Who'll be speaking first will be Tariq Ali, who many of you know as somebody who's been involved in anti-war campaigning going right back to Vietnam in the 1960s, and who's been involved in campaigning against, I think, pretty much every war that Britain has been involved in since. And we've got also Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the opposition, a former chair of Stop the War Coalition, and a great friend of the anti-war movement and campaigner for a whole number of rights campaigns internationally. I'm going to ask both of them to speak for a few minutes to introduce the session, which is about foreign policy after the US election. And of course, this is a huge topic. We won't be able to cover all of it, but we do hope to cover quite a few things. They'll speak for a few minutes each, and then there'll be discussion between the two of them about where they think things are going, and also to answer some of the questions that you've put up. So thanks very much for joining in, and I'll call on Tariq to speak first. Thank you very much, Tariq.
Thank you, Lindsay, and very happy to be with Jeremy again on a virtual platform. I think we've done this so many times now over the last 30 years that I can't even count. But let's see now, what is going to happen to foreign policy under Biden? I think not too much. I think they will now, sort of having got rid of Trump, or the electorate having got rid of Trump and his capacity to annoy and antagonize large numbers of his European allies, they will now move to calm all that down, get Europe on the same track again on most issues, and carry on as before, with one exception. The one difference there was between the Obama and Trump foreign policies, well, there were two. Trump, for all his other crimes and horrors, didn't actually launch a new war. He didn't get the troops out as he promised. He didn't launch a new war. But the one difference was on Iran, that the Democrats had, for their own particular reasons, decided to do a deal with Iran to agree on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, rightly or wrongly is a matter of debate, and not to put too many sanctions on them, to actually bring Iran into the fold. And that was stymied by Trump, with the rising of, war noises, largely under pressure from the Israelis. And just a tiny note on that Obama's latest book, in which, is pretty bland, most of it, but he does say that the big problem for him was created by the noises Netanyahu would make non-stop, and AIPAC, and pressuring the White House non-stop. And basically what those 4 paragraphs explain, according to Obama, is that US went against its own national interests when it was backing Israel. So this is from the mouth of the United States president, who was in office for 8 years. On other things, I think Biden will carry on with the China policy, which Trump launched, of targeting China economically, attacking it ideologically, something they didn't do prior to Trump, though tensions were rising because of the Chinese economic situation, and the Chinese miracle, as some call it. And that I think they will proceed with, which will mean and could mean bringing Japan more into the US foreign policy adventures abroad. They've already done it, partially in Afghanistan, partially elsewhere. Whether they will grant the Japanese the right to have nuclear weapons, I don't know, to be perfectly honest. But if China is the main economic target, then all the US assets in that region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, will be badly needed, and Europe will have to be brought on side. And lastly, in the Middle East, I don't think too much will change. I think as far as Israel is concerned, there's no question of going back for Biden and Kamala Harris and the Antony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, on reverting to the status quo ante. I think effectively the Western powers have decided to forget about what Israel is going to do and is doing to the Palestinians every single day. And they have accepted de facto, if not de jure, the dismantling of what exists and the Israeli annexation. So on that, there will be no big difference between Obama and Biden, and effectively full spectrum dominance is back on again. That's what we're going to see. So we need a strong anti-war movement in the United States. That's what we really need, something that's been missing now for a long time. I mean, one has to bear in mind and remember that the United States is an imperial state. It's the only imperial state in the world, and therefore politicians as such have to operate within those parameters, and you know, there's very little else they can do unless they are principled, which these guys surely are not. And the appointment of Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, this was a guy who, when the Democrats had a majority in the Senate, was secretary to the Foreign Relations Committee under Biden, backed the war, stopped any experts who were opposed to the war from coming on and testifying before the committee. He backed the Iraq war, he backed the Libya war, he's backed the policies on Israel-Palestine, and he backed a Libyan war which even Biden didn't. The only thing to Biden's credit, he did not back the war on Libya, which Obama caved into, and the three ladies, women in his circle, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, and Hillary Clinton, pushed that through. So I don't think with this Secretary of State, and it's a clear signal that we will improve the way we operate, but nothing fundamentally is going to change. So don't expect too much, with the possibility that on Iran they might reverse Trump's course, which of course would be positive were they to do that even in a limited way. Jeremy, over to you.
Oh, sorry. I was waiting for the chair to intervene, and of course, we're chairing ourselves tonight, Tariq. It's wonderful to be on the call with you. And Lindsay, thank you for your opening remarks. And thank you to everyone in Stop the War for not just putting on this event tonight, but of all the events over the years. And I have to say, when we founded Stop the War in 2001, I honestly did not believe that 20 years later, Stop the War would be as necessary as ever, as an important organization to mobilize people and give space for the kind of discussion and debate we're having tonight. The US elections obviously produced dramatic results. a huge vote majority for Biden over Trump, and the election was really completely dominated by Trump, and it was either for or against Trump, and clearly the majority of Americans came out against Trump. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about US foreign policy and global issues that the new administration will be dealing with. And I think there's some very mixed messages coming up there. The first thing I'd say is that we have to put all this in the context of a very changed world because of the coronavirus. The costs of the coronavirus have been huge. In industrial countries, it's been dealt with so far by a sort of rather cold Keynesian economics where there has been deficit budgeting to get through. But I suspect we're now going to move into a phase which is going to be one of intense austerity against the public sector, as already seeing in this country and around the world, and quite brutal economic restructuring in the poorest countries of the world. And those that have not yet been forced to privatize their publicly owned assets and industries will find huge pressure from the world's financial institutions and private sector banks to do just that. Biden has committed himself to a very high level of military expenditure, and through the new Secretary of State Blinken has made it very clear they see there the importance of re-establishing American leadership around the world without specifying exactly what that means. But I think the way Tariq put it is actually very correct in that they will seek to re-establish the norm of relations with Europe, with NATO, will continue the quasi-Cold War against Russia, where when a more rational person would say, let's have that human rights and peace dialogue with Russia and recognize the real issues facing the world, global inequalities, global poverty, and environmental destruction, rather than going to increased military tensions. The issues around the world of military tensions are huge, and the biggest military tension is in the Middle East, is at the moment the Saudi Arabian bombing and continued campaign against Yemen, and the huge tensions that are rising between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region, and the determination of the Trump administration to stoke up those tensions rather than reduce them, and the British government's huge sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, which is something that I believe should have been stopped some time ago, which would have helped to bring about a peace process in Yemen and hopefully a permanent ceasefire with a political solution. We also have to recognize that insecurity around the world is a combination of economic insecurity, is climate change, is disease insecurity, and Corona has shown us to be very vulnerable on that. Yet we have the 5 declared nuclear weapon states all either increasing or renewing the nuclear weapons that they've got, and a non-proliferation treaty process that is due to meet again next year, and that would be a good point for the peace movement to campaign on. And in Britain, the government has announced a substantial increase in defence expenditure a couple of weeks ago, and as Lindsay pointed out, that increase in expenditure is being paid for by public sector cuts, and in particular public sector wage freezes, but it's also being paid for by a cut in the overseas aid budget. I can think of nothing more crass and irresponsible to do than at the time of trying to get out of COVID to cut overseas aid and support for international institutions at the very time when quite clearly a global health service is required, and support the WHO aspiration of universal access to healthcare across the world. And the last general points I want to make are these, that we are all fed this diet that there is no alternative to what's being said by our betters all around the world, and that we have to spend more on defense in order to protect ourselves from insecurity, when the reality is we should be confronting the reasons for that insecurity, which are largely poverty, economic inequality, and environmental change, but also recognize around the world that there are huge spirits of rebellion. The Bolivian people reasserted themselves after a legal coup against their government, and Mas won the election in Bolivia, and Evo Morales is now back in his own country. That is a victory for people against all the odds and against all the pressure they were put under by the world's media to do the opposite. And the reach of global free-for-all, free market economics has its limits. It was quite interesting to see, mainly on Al Jazeera, because the other channels weren't reporting it, huge farmers' demonstrations in India against the removal of price protection for farm products. In other words, throwing Indian farmers into competition with highly mechanized and indeed highly subsidized American agriculture as opposed to their own, and the damage that will do to rural life in India. And I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be, but the opposition, those farmers to it, is fascinating. And the other areas of the world, back to Latin America, in a sense, where there are huge opposition going on, which has made a difference to the economic and political climate, have been in Chile, where the government was forced to hold a referendum, which then wanted to have a new popular constitution, and the whole country is now engaged in writing that constitution, and thus opening up an enormous area of political debate. And the opposition that's being raised in Guatemala to the poverty and inequality of that country. So there are issues around the world that I think the COVID crisis has brought to people's attention. The use of Zoom technology and others that talk to each other around the world has opened the eyes of a lot of people to the simplicity of talking to people in other countries. I mean, I've been on a number of calls recently where we've had up to 200,000 people on those calls. A demonstration of 200,000 people is a pretty major undertaking in this country, pretty big undertaking anywhere in the world. But to get those kind of numbers on virtual technology, talking to each other and listening to each other, is something that is very, very powerful. And absolute last point I make is this. In all of this, there are victims. There are victims of deindustrialization in Western economies. There are victims of wars brought about by Western powers. I'm thinking particularly of Iraq and Libya at the present time, but there are other examples. And then there are the 60-odd million people who are refugees in the world, who are victims of all of that, and environmental and human rights disasters as well. And so there's an awful lot for us on the left to grasp hold of, but above all to have that global perspective. The right and the racists have no answer to any of this. The warmongers can only bring us another war and more destruction that goes with it, as sadly we predicted in 2003 at that massive demonstration we held in Hyde Park, where were held all over the world at that time. So I think we need to be in close contact and collaboration with our friends in the United States, as well as all over the world, to ensure that global movement is strong in defense of justice, for peace, for human rights, but above all, for one of global equality. If we stand back and do nothing, free markets will destroy the planet. It is up to us to do it a bit differently. Tariq, over to you, my friend.
Okay, I'm just getting some questions.
Oh, good. I can't see any questions. Where would they be?
They would be under Q&A on your screen.
Okay, yeah, got it. Yep.
Okay. One is from Gavin Everell. Tariq and Jeremy, what are the likely directions of the UK government and opposition on foreign policy and US relations post-election? Well, my response to that is that they will be very different from a few years ago when Jeremy was leading the Labour Party. And as far as the opposition is concerned, the new leader of the Labour Party and his deputy and the shadow foreign secretary have more or less said that it's back to normal now. And I'm told that Starmer said this in his meeting with Pompeo, don't worry, all is under control. And relations with the US between the government, this government or, you know, another government will be the same as they've been for some time. Britain is a subordinate power. And it basically has not opposed any significant thing that the United States has done for a very long time. I mean, even when the United States toppled the government in Grenada many years ago, Thatcher wasn't pleased and the Queen expressed even stronger regret, but there's nothing they could do about it. So once you're caught in this alliance, I think, you know, you're sunk, really. That's why, I mean, Britain were less trying to behave like an imperial understudy of the United States or a bloodshot adjutant like Blair did during the Iraq War. The country would win a lot more respect abroad. At the moment, it's not taken seriously at all. I mean, a number of senior Foreign Office people have told me that Britain's support for the Iraq war wrecked their standing. Well, why be surprised? And that hasn't changed, in my opinion. Jeremy, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, on Iraq, Britain was actually out of step with most of Europe on that, as everyone I'm sure will remember on this call, that most of Europe thought that Iraq was a crazy idea and there was no legal or moral justification for the war. I think all of us that opposed the war have sadly been proved to be right on that. I promised when I stood for leader of the Labour Party that I would change that policy and would issue an apology on behalf of the party for the involvement in the Iraq war, which I duly did on the day that the Chilcot report came out. And that was on the day of the most intense opposition to my position I'd ever known on that particular day. And of course, there are many reasons for that. And what I was trying to do was set a foreign policy agenda that recognized that you have to deal with global inequality in order to deal with the climate crisis and the humanitarian crisis around the world, and that should be our priority. I also believe this fits in with the mood that has come, it's been there for a long time, but particularly intensely this year through Black Lives Matters movement, of an understanding of the brutality of history and the way in which our young people are taught history. So I was very keen that we should change the approach on that, and that there were a number of colonial hangover issues that I felt we should deal with immediately. We're in a position to do so, such as the Chagos Islanders, the position of people in the Western Sahara, but also opening up the files and books on colonial atrocities, such as the war in Kenya in the 1950s, such as the atrocities in Malaya in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And before this call started, Tariq was talking to Lindsay and myself about stuff he'd been reading of Japanese massacres in China during the Chinese-Japanese War. So my whole approach was to do things in a rather different way. If we just go back to a Me Tooism on foreign policy, then I hope it doesn't happen, of course, but should a future US administration decide that it wants to have a proxy war with China somewhere, or there is a danger of some kind of conflict breaking out, such as happened in Iraq, are we once more going to be on the wrong side of history? Or are we for once going to say, no, we'll not do things this way. We'll choose the path of peace rather than the path of conflict. That doesn't mean you're uncritical of other countries. It doesn't mean you're uncritical of human rights abuses or inequalities in that other society, but you do engage with them. And I think surely the tragedy of Iraq, the tragedy of Syria, the tragedy of Libya are there to behold. Libya, we were told, would be a way of bringing peace, justice and democracy to Libya by undertaking bombardment of that country. It's now a huge refugee camp with a huge loss of life over the past years and a very, very uncertain future and very desperate people stuck in refugee camps trying to get out. That is a product of poverty and inequality in Northern Africa. It's also a product of the wars that we as a country have supported.
Yeah, I think there's some other questions which participants sent in before we started. How well did Tariq or Jeremy know Robert Fisk? And do they have any reflections on his life? Well, I knew Bob, of course, but he wasn't a close friend. But he lived in a different part of the world. Most of his life he spent, or a large part of it, in Beirut. But I did know him, and especially given the fact that he's under ferocious attack since he died by mainstream journalists. I mean, the filth, and I will use that word, you read on Twitter, attacking Bob Fisk by, basically Foreign Office journalists working for the liberal media, is appalling. Why did they never say these things to Bob Fisk when he was alive? Then he could have dealt with them. But it's an attempt to discredit him, and you have to ask why. And I think the reason they want to discredit Fisk, especially these, younger journalists who say, oh, we admired him when we were students, but basically he turned out to be a fraud, without supplying any evidence whatsoever, is because the role most of these journalists are playing now, effectively, is to act as spokespeople in one form or the other for the Foreign Office, like many journalists do elsewhere in Europe too. And Fisk annoyed them by coming up with something different, which made lots of his mainstream colleagues, though he was mainstream himself, but he was one of a type, after John Pilger was not allowed to write regularly for The Guardian. Fisk in The Independent wrote regularly, and he often found stuff which others had been denied. And this angered lots of people because they were asked questions, if Bob Fisk can write that, why can't you? And it's difficult to say then, oh, we can't really because we support the government. Whatever it's doing, our basic line is to support them. So Fisk was very remarkable, actually, and he didn't start off life on the left. He wasn't off the left, incidentally. He was one of those old school journalists who believed that in order to write and report on something, you had to carry out a minimal investigation before you immediately wrote down what the Foreign Office wanted you to write. Because there was a lot of interference in earlier days as well when he was young, and there were a group of journalists who did that. Bob was among them. He survived, so he carried on doing it. And obviously, he may have made some mistakes, who doesn't? But to slander him, as is being done now, is outrageous, really outrageous.
I like Tariq. I can't pretend I knew Bob Fisk well. I met him a number of times and I was impressed by him. And the reason you got a little tour of my study on the phone a moment ago was I was going to pick up this book by Bob, which is The Great War for Civilization, The Conquest of the Middle East by Robert Fisk. And a few nights ago, I did a program for Crispin Flintoff and said, what books would you like to take away with you if you were cast away into some space from which you would never return? And I said, I'd like to take this book because it's so well written, so well researched, and with the global view of history that he has, asks a lot of questions, and I think helps one to understand a great deal about the issues facing the Middle East today from the colonial past, from the Ottoman, from the other empires, from the many wars that the Middle East has been subject to, and all of the current conflicts that are going on. And I think Bob Fisk is somebody that, it's disgusting actually the way he's been attacked since his death. And as people probably know, he lived mainly in Beirut, and I went to Beirut some years ago with Gerald Kaufman and others on a delegation, but I traveled separately from them. And when I arrived in the airport in Beirut, there was something wrong with my passport and so on, and the proper procedures not being followed. And so I eventually had a very congenial discussion with the head of security at the airport. And he said to me, I don't know if it was meant to be a trick question or what. He said, well, who do you know in Beirut? I said, well, Robert Fisk. And he went, what? You've met Robert Fisk? I said, yeah. He said, fine, and stamped my passport straight away. And I came straight in. He was a revered figure by many in the Middle East because he would write it like it is. And whenever an incident happens anywhere in that region, I would always go to Robert Fisk to see what he said about it first, because I do think his knowledge was quite extraordinary. And those that are condemning him now, their moment in the spotlight will disappear. Robert Fisk's work will live on for a very long time because his descriptions of the reality of conflicts in the Middle East was something that is going to be read about for a very long time to come. So I say, rest in peace, Robert Fisk.
Another question we've got, what can be done? This is from Beauvais Martin. What can be done against the USA's aggressive policies against Iran and Israel's suspected assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist in Iran on the 27th of November? Well, we've already discussed a bit the US policies against Iran, and whether the one thing that might happen is, since Biden was Obama's vice president, and they were trying a slightly different approach to Iran, whether they'll return to that, we'll see. If they did, it would be positive, because I mean, the targeting of Iran has been grotesque by the United States under Trump and before, prior to the changes that were made. As far as Israel's suspected assassination, we now have a very good piece written by the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy in Haaretz, the liberal paper, which comes out and publishes more criticisms of Israel than any single newspaper in the West, liberal or conservative. And Gideon Levy has said that Israel has become a master for over years in the art of targeted assassinations. And he has said, just imagine, and he's named the 3 top Israeli nuclear scientists who built the Israeli bomb. He said, just imagine if any country had targeted these 3 guys and knocked them out. There would have been hell to pay. There would have been cries of war, bomb them, do this. But because it's an Iranian nuclear scientist, there is absolutely no response at all. And Gideon writes, I have no doubt whatsoever that this was done by the Israelis. They more or less admitted it. They're very proud. They're congratulating themselves. Prior to that, they targeted and killed Soleimani, who was a senior Israeli military officer, very popular in Iran itself and in parts of the Middle East. And that they didn't even bother to deny, that it was, reportedly, we don't know, carried out by a special CIA unit collaborating with the Israelis. That's how they operate. So who knows is the answer to your question in terms of the extent to which US policies against Iran will change. One thing one should add to all this, that in addition to the wars that are fought, targeted assassinations, non-stop surveillance, spying, add to that something else that happens, which is economic sanctions. And economic sanctions are now treated very openly by the United States as a weapon to topple governments, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq. They tried that for a long, long time. It's just become a weapon they use automatically without it being questioned. Now, the Russians and the Chinese refuse to accept the sanctions on Iran. Many other countries don't either. So they carry on trading, but it makes it very difficult for Iran to trade economically with Western Europe, for instance, with which it has had some links. And there were divisions between the United States and some of the European countries on this targeting of Iran. So we'll see. We don't really know. We just have to wait.
Well, the isolation of Iran is very dangerous and very wrong. And Tariq pointed out the economic sanctions against Iran by the United States are enormous. They have caused a lot of real hurt in the Iranian economy. And whilst they have reconfigured trade to some extent with Japan and China and so on, the reality is that the reach of the US on sanctions is very big indeed. And under using the principles of the Helms-Burton Act, they're able to take sanctions against any company that trades in a country which the US says they should not trade in, even if that is not an American company. So in other words, a Dutch company trading in Iran would then find it very difficult to trade in the USA. A European bank opening services in Iran would find themselves being fined or shut down in the USA. And so it goes on. And so the sanctions regime is brutal and its effect is absolutely enormous. And the attempts to isolate Iran are huge. And now, whilst I have many criticisms of Iran on human rights issues, on the imprisonment of Nazanin, and indeed the use of the death penalty, I also thought that the Iran nuclear agreement was an enormous step forward and something to be absolutely welcome, because it gave the opportunity for a long-term aspiration of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, a weapons of mass destruction-free zone all across the Middle East. That was stopped in a sense by Trump, because when the agreement had finally been reached and was making progress, and the International Atomic Energy Authority confirmed that degree of progress, Trump sort of stopped it, not appearing to understand it was an international agreement, not a bilateral agreement between the USA and Iran. And so President Biden-elect, or President-elect Biden, saying that he would return to the Iran nuclear agreement is, I think, welcome and a good thing. And I hope that actually takes place, because that will help to reduce a lot of tensions in the region. But, and this is a big but, the build-up of US influence and cooperation with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, mainly in hostility towards Iran, does provide a huge flashpoint. And the more naval forces that are put into the Strait of Hormuz, the pressure that builds up, the dangers of an incident, maybe accidental, but an incident of some sort, which could lead to a hot war, are absolutely huge. And so there has to be a reckoning and a rapprochement with Iran. And that does mean looking at peace across the whole region, including in Yemen, as I've said, but it also means that the agreements with Bahrain and UAE, which are uncritical of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, or indeed of their aspirations of annexation of the West Bank, are not going to be challenged by the US administration. I hope that the Biden administration, which has said it would be opposed to the annexation strategy, sees that through and actively withdraws from not just the strategy of annexation, but support for the Israeli strategy of occupation and settlements as well. Because in a sense, as Tariq said at the beginning, the annexation is taking place by stealth with the growth of settlements all across the West Bank. There has to be peace in the region.
Another subject we haven't discussed, and the question has come up on it. Do you think there will be a different approach to India on Kashmir or other subjects under this administration? To be frank, my answer is no. I think Kashmir is an issue which has been buried by the West, by the United States, and its European allies, and by most people. Very few people take it up. The Pakistan government itself hasn't succeeded in organizing any serious campaign in defense of the civil liberties of the Kashmiri people, leave alone their demand, a totally justified demand for self-determination. So India gets away with murder. And having a government in India, which the polite way of saying is it's a majoritarian government, which various newspapers have started to do, including the Financial Times, which is getting worried about Modi's authoritarianism. But I think one can go beyond that and say that this is effectively an elected semi-fascist government that we have got now in India that is targeting dissenters from all religions, that is encouraging Islamophobia and anti-Islam conspiracy theories on an astonishing level, and which is locking people up, encouraging violence against sections of the population. And so as far as Kashmir is concerned, everyone has more or less stopped speaking except various Kashmiri people themselves. Even Muslims in India are nervous, in the rest of India, are nervous to talk about Kashmir lest they be accused of being terrorists, because Kashmir has been branded terrorist because of some crazy thing the Pakistani military did decades ago by sending in jihadis after the defeat of the Russians in Afghanistan, which they began to believe was they'd done, whereas actually it was the United States and the West which carried out that mission using Pakistan. But they thought they could do the same in Kashmir. And that sending in jihadi groups was a disaster for the Kashmiri people. But to jump from that and say that the whole of Kashmir is terrorist is of course crazy, and no one really believes it. Anyone who knows Kashmiri people, Kashmiri organizations, what's going on in there, and apart from Arundhati Roy and Pankaj Misra and a handful of other intellectuals, not much is being done in India. I don't see the Biden administration changing tack on that because India, for the United States, is the single most important ally they now have on the Asian continent, and especially if they're going to target China, let's hope never militarily, because that would be crazy, but imposing sanctions or whatever, they will need India to do it. And they will need India's help So for that reason and other reasons of India's strategic position, I can't see any big shift in Biden or anyone else in relation to Kashmir or what is actually happening inside India today.
I agree. I don't think there's likely to be any great change in US policy on this at all, and certainly not in recognizing two big factors on Kashmir. One is that it didn't have a settled status at independence. The issue was referred to the UN by Nehru, and the UN said there should be a decision made by the people of Kashmir. That decision has never been made, and ever since then, until very recently, Kashmir had that special status. That is now under threat by the recent laws that have been passed, and there are now elections going on in Kashmir in a very, very tense atmosphere indeed because of that. And I was anxious that we should ensure that issues around the world are dealt with in a legal and in a proportionate way, and that's why I referred to Kashmir in the election manifesto we put last year, and came out at our party conference as well, as the need for the people of Kashmir to be able to decide their own future. I share Tariq's concerns about the recent citizenship laws in India and the atmosphere surrounding them. But I also take some comfort, as I said in my opening remarks, to the way in which there are huge groups in India that are standing up against environmental degradation and the loss of farming and habitat as a result of it, and the farmers' protests, and also the way in which many Dalit peoples have stood up against the way that they've been treated, particularly the way Dalit women have been treated in society as a whole. And so I think it is important that the peace movement around the world include that dialogue with peace activists in India, and that India and Pakistan both come back to the non-proliferation treaty process, and we see a reduction and hopefully removal of nuclear weapons in South Asia, which are now held by both India and Pakistan, because surely the issues have to be addressing the poverty and the inequality and the injustices, none of which are going to be solved by increased arms expenditure.
We've got another question, Jeremy. Mike Pompeo has declared BDS to be anti-Semitic, and similar attempts to inhibit solidarity with Palestine are being made in Britain. Meanwhile, Israel is using Trump's last days to ramp up house demolitions and attacks on Palestinians. Even though Biden is unlikely to change the US's position on Palestine, how do we counter this and build solidarity with Palestine?
Well, yesterday was the International Day for Palestine, and a lot of people all around the world took part in that. And the UN General Secretary sent out a very good statement in support of Palestinian people. But the reality has to be that the occupation must end, and the economic benefit that's gained through the sale of goods from settlements enhances the strength of the settlements. Surely the issue has to be no trade with settlement goods, and that is clearly a policy that's been adopted by a number of people around the world, not least the European Union, as a way of hoping to drive back the whole settlement policy. But it's also about the annexation strategy, which both of us mentioned earlier on. The proposal by the Netanyahu administration to annex a huge proportion of the West Bank on top of the settlement policy they already have would mean the Palestinian people would find it impossible to survive as an entity, because they would be divided up into small little units dotted all across the West Bank. And so it is, I think, important that we have a foreign policy that does not recognise the settlement strategy or the occupation, but requires a settlement, as is Resolution 242 and others, on the basis of 1967 borders. Pompeo claims that it is anti-Semitic to do that. Anti-Semitism is wrong in any circumstances, any time, any place. And I'll have no truck with it in any form whatsoever. And that has got to be clear, and I'm sure it'll be clear, as equally clear from you, Tariq, as from me. And it is not helpful if clearly wrong foreign policies, such as annexation of Palestine, are then equated in that way, as Pompeo has done. And even our own discussions in this country made it very clear that it is perfectly right and proper to be critical of the foreign policy of another country, in this case Israel, or its occupation policy, whilst at the same time supporting the rights of people, Jewish people, to their identity, their faith, their religion, and to offer them that protection. Anti-Semitism is a vile form of racism and has to be opposed at all times.
Yeah, I agree very strongly with Jeremy on all that. And I think I will just say this, that the weaponizing of anti-Semitism to attack anyone, especially politicians who've been extremely principled all their adult lives on these questions, is a disgrace. It should be stopped. And the one thing those who use this campaign to discredit people, such as Jeremy, have not understood that they're doing no favors to Jewish people themselves. By using it in this crude form, they actually debase the fight against anti-Semitism, not just here, but elsewhere, including parts of the Arab world. This doesn't help in that particular struggle. And of course, if you're so obsessed with power and so triumphalist about everything the Israelis are doing that you don't care, I'm warning, it will end badly. The late Isaac Deutscher, who lost the bulk of his family in the Judeo-side of the Second World War, after his last meeting with Ben-Gurion, came back quite depressed. And after the Six-Day War, he actually gave a very angry interview in which he said, I'm deeply disturbed by what the Israelis are up to. And he reminded Ben-Gurion and others of an old Prussian proverb, be careful, you can triumph yourselves to death. Very striking remark that he made. So I think we should really try and get away from the use of anti-Semitism to try and stop genuine political questions being asked of Israeli acts and atrocities and daily crimes being committed against the Palestinian people. They're not allowed to live normal lives. They're not allowed to plow their lands. Often these lands are attacked by the settlers. Their olive trees are being destroyed. What is all this if not a prelude to annexation, to really punish a population before the eyes of the whole world? And now even in the Arab world, the regimes are turning their backs on the Palestinians, and we will carry on supporting them. And look, the late Edward Said always used to say that BDS is an extremely important development. He was in favor of it long before it became a movement. And he said there is no way in which we can win violently. I am afraid that is just has to be accepted. So what campaigns can we wage that are non-violent? And it's precisely because of that that BDS was formed. Boycott, divestment, sanctions, to avoid violence and to give people a different alternative to put pressure on Israel. Now, if you say violence is impossible, you're all terrorists, and people saying, well, we're not terrorists, but we don't want violence. We want a non-violent way forward. And you're now saying BDS, which is the non-violent way forward, is unacceptable because it's anti-Semitic. I mean, it's a nonsensical, circular argument, and we should have no truck with it. And if that's the case, then you can define South Africa officially. The South African government, the African National Congress, the judicial sections of the judiciary as anti-Semites. Break off all relations with this anti-Semitic country, because that is where the largest support for BDS is coming from South Africa. And from Jewish members of the ANC who've taken delegations to Palestine and say that when you say this is anti-apartheid, that this is apartheid, you're actually doing us a wrong. Apartheid was not as bad as what we're witnessing now in South Africa. I've heard black trade union leaders from South Africa say that. So a sense of balance is required. One other thing, Jeremy, a question has just come up saying, do you think, where is it? What is your, do you think the Biden government is going to have a different attitude to the extradition of Julian Assange?
I can't really answer that because I don't know. I would hope so, and I am opposed to the extradition of Julian Assange, and I've made that very, very clear. And indeed, on my behalf, John McDonnell went to see Julian in prison to talk about his situation and his condition. And I think a campaign to support and defend Julian Assange is very important, as it helps us all to know some truths about what's going on around the world. And that really is about as much as you can ask from anyone who's a journalist, to help us to know the truth about what's actually happening around the world. And so I would be completely opposed to his removal to the USA. There are human and moral arguments, but there's also very strong legal arguments in his support. And I do admire those that have worked so hard to support and defend him at the present time.
I agree entirely. I think that the fact that Julian is being tried, it's a show trial taking place in London, a political show trial. I sat in the court for one day, and have been reading reports of it regularly, not reports published in the newspapers, but reports written, very serious reports written and circulated online by observers from different parts of the world who prior to the lockdown were attending the trial, and even during the lockdown tried to follow it from a room with earphones, etc., audio. With help of the audio systems. And the reports are all in agreement that it is a scandal of the first order. Not just that, but, you know, what is the point of a judge behaving in such a fashion, in an arbitrary fashion, turning down perfectly decent, normal requests in terms of the conditions under which this prisoner is being kept at Belmarsh prison. I mean, first they kept him in solitary. Then when other prisoners, not at all sympathetic to him even, but just out of solidarity told the governor of the prison, we won't accept Julian being kept, he should mingle with us, talk to us, eat with us, etc. They then retreated a bit. They've now used the lockdown to keep him in solitary and other prisoners as well. And he's just sent out an appeal saying, I really feel now for the first time that they want to kill me in prison. They want me to die in prison. Well, let's hope this doesn't happen. But I think a question now is, why is a prisoner like him being kept at Belmarsh? Because he jumped bail once, but you know, there's no way he's going to do that again, and they can keep him in a less strict prison where they usually keep heads of corporations caught for committing corporate crimes, who then pretend they are ill and are released a year after spending time in quite a comfy prison. So at the very least, they should change Julian's prison conditions. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is the big crime he's committed that he's being extradited for? And the answer is telling the truth by revealing the war crimes in Iraq being committed by US soldiers. They can't forget that, and they won't forgive that, because the whole way they set up the media was precisely after the Vietnam War that people didn't see everything, that it was very selective, things that Al Jazeera, by the way, and Telesur and others defied. But the mainstream channels in the West kept to that. Julian then came, not just on his own, with the help of Chelsea Manning, who actually leaked the documents, made available the materials to the entire mainstream media. The New York Times published them, The Guardian published them, El País published them, Le Monde published them, the German press published them. And why is he then just on trial? For what? I mean, why not? If you really want to teach mainstream journalists a lesson, arrest them. Go and arrest Alan Rusbridger, who did it. Go and arrest the New York Times editor of the time who published this stuff. So, and the aim of the operation is punish him so hard that no one ever does it again. But I'll just say something on that. If you carry out these wars continuously, as you're doing, if you carry out atrocities as continuously you're doing, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, conditions in the Yemen are appalling. You carry on like that, and sooner or later, some decent person on your side will leak stuff again. It's happened in virtually every war since Vietnam.
That's how the My Lai massacre stuff came out, wasn't it?
Sorry?
The My Lai massacre was only revealed by that means, in the first place.
Exactly. The Pentagon Papers and others. I think Julian should be released, really, and given bail, and then, you know, we'll see how the trial goes. Yeah. Lindsay, we've gone on.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great point on which to end this, and I think, you know, you've covered so many really, really interesting questions, and you've done it so well, and I'm sure everybody has got a huge amount out of this. So thank you very, very much. And Jeremy, can I just say as well how much in solidarity with you we all are in Stop the War, and how much we recognise what you've contributed and continue to contribute, and we will not support the attacks on you that are going on. So all best and all solidarity to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. The only thing you missed out was I hope to contribute in the future as well.
Well, of course, I'm taking that for granted. I'm taking that absolutely for granted. So thank you again, and thanks to everybody who's attended. Thanks for all the questions that you've put in. They answered loads. There were even more questions that weren't answered, but that's good. We can continue these discussions and continue campaigning and continue organising. So please do sign up to support Stop the War. Do sign up as members. Do donate. Come to our fundraiser next week, where you can hear from these two fantastic speakers again, and please do everything you can.
And I'm bringing a prize to the Stop the War fundraiser as well.
You're bringing a prize? Well, is that a secret, or can you tell us what it is?
No, it's not a secret. You know all about it. You asked me. A jar of jam, a homemade jam.
Jar of jam. Very, very special jam, Jeremy's jam. It's quite unique.
Made with these hands.
We're looking forward to raffling it and auctioning it next week. So thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Tariq.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bye. See you soon.
Bye.